All right, hello everyone. Today is May 5th, and this is the Atlanta FileMaker Developers Group. Our presenter today is Robert Naud. Did I say that properly?
Yes, you can say no or node.
Naud, Robert Naud,
Yeah,
okay.
it makes it clear there's a D at the end.
All right, and then he's going to be presenting today on code readability. So Robert, if you'd like to take it away.
Yes, absolutely. I'll do that. I'll just, for the presentation, I think I'll be cutting down my webcam and turning on my screen share. Here we go. Coming right up. And going to... All right, so if I could just get confirmation that you're seeing my presentation, that'd be great.
Yep, it looks good.
Wonderful. All right, so today, yes, indeed, we're going to be talking about making our code more readable because it's maybe not as fancy as
Oh,
JavaScript
and real quick, by the way, Robert, if you can just click that hide button there on the screen, that'll stop that from blocking some of your content. There you go. Yep.
Absolutely. Here we go. Okay,
There you go.
better now.
Yep.
Yes. So what I was going to say is code readability may not be as fancy as JavaScript or Linux or anything else that we may be hearing that is trendy, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to it. So it's more of back to basics kind of content, but it's good to keep a close eye on that kind of stuff. So no one is against virtue, but knowing why virtue is good in the first place can give us some incentive to look into it more closely and understand why it's good to care about those things. So, as David said, my name is Robert, and I'm a father who sings choir. Although right now it's a bit difficult with COVID to engage into that type of activity, and I like to code with Claris FileMaker, and I am lazy. And I'll try to convince you that being lazy can be a good thing, and we'll see if I succeed or not at this. I started Accolade Plus Accolade in 2019. I've been using FileMaker since 2005, and my company's tagline is "Communication is everything, and everything is communication," and this applies to code also. Our objective for today is going to be to see how we can push comments down the list of tools we have when we want to make our code more readable. I think comments can be useful, but sometimes they're a bit too much of a crutch we rely on. So they could be the biggest threat to making our code more readable. Just too easy to rely on and can almost be perceived as our only tool. So I'm not against them, but I just believe there are some reflexes we have that are worth fighting off. So today we're going to look at why it is a good idea to care about this. We're going to look into naming, have a discussion on what kind of tools we can implement when we are coding, and then we're going to discuss comments because it's kind of the elephant in the room. If we are to use it, let's make sure we use them at the right time for the right purpose. We're going to discuss some helpful gadgets, parting notes, and discussion as time allows. So just as I say, just yeah, make sure to interrupt me at any point in time in this presentation. If you feel like you have comments or question, do so. Just unmute yourself and fire away. Aside from that, I would say, well, a lot of the content is subjective, so I'm not trying to come up with hard and fast rules or anything that would be to follow by the book. So some stuff may work for you and not for the person next to you. It may work for me and not be suitable for you, and that's perfectly fine. Some of what I will be showing is based on my own practice, and it is changing There is no set it and forget it. There is also content that is derived from things that were shared in the community, and if I'm unable to trace back whoever released that first into the wild, I'm sorry if I failed to give proper credit. And also some of this can be long-lasting, and with that in mind, I will be borrowing from Jerry Robbins' 2014 DevCon presentation, and I hope you like quotes. Speaking of quotes, here is one. What's good code? Well, all relationships are based on trust. Customers, employees, partners, where we eat, what we eat. It applies to code also. How can we trust something if we don't understand it? How are we going to understand it if reading the code is not making that easy? So let's see why we should care, and how not caring can cost us a lot more than we think. So more quotes. Here we've got Martin Fowler, who says, any fool can write code that a computer can understand, and really our job is to write code that humans can understand. And what that means is we don't have to just make stuff work, but we have to make stuff make sense. And that's a whole different job. And here we have Jessica, who says, one man's crappy software is another man's full-time job. And I know that there can be issues about job security, but this kind of full-time job is not a fun one. It's not what we want to seek after, and let's make sure that we're mindful of that. So why should we care? Well, we should care first for others. Our code is not just set in stone. It's alive, and people will want to go in and play with it, read it, make changes to it. So, but for them to do that, they need to understand it in the first place. And if that is hard to do, well, it's making it hard on them, and really they're not going to like us. So let's make them like us a little bit more, like our code a little bit more, and everyone's going to be happier. And the other thing is, well, it's not just for others, it's also for ourselves, because things change and we end up having to revisit our own code. And sometimes it's harder than we would like to admit. So it could be 6 months from now, it can be a year from now, but it can also be 2 months from now or 2 weeks from now. And yeah, I'm sure we all came upon something we wrote, and we ended up scratching our head more than we would have liked. So let's just make sure that we write in a way where when we read our own code, then we don't come to the conclusion of, is it really me who wrote this? You know, so what happens if code cannot be trusted or understood? Well, there are 3 things that come into play here, and they matter a whole bunch. The first one is about maintenance and updates. If you get someone looking at your code and say, well, I'd rather not touch it, you know, that's not really what's going to keep your code alive. It's more what's going to keep your code on the shelf, gathering dust until someone pulls the plug on it and just throw it out to the trash. So let's try and avoid something where maintenance and updates is arduous, because it's not going to make our code live long, basically. Is it working? Well, I don't know. Maybe. Doesn't sound too reassuring. And actually, I don't think there's any single way you can pronounce those words that will make the answer more reassuring. It's just not the answer you expect when you're asking that question. So if you have some code and you have someone reading your code, the expectation is that it is understandable and that you can know that it is working and how it's working. And if something is not working, that you can somewhat easily pinpoint why it's not working and where it's not working and those kind of things. So all of that usually is taking us to let's start over, or the Ikea effect. And what that means is that basically, even if the code works perfectly fine, it can still fall victim to not being understood and not being trusted. So what happens then is, well, like I said, we're going to take the code and just put it out to the trash, and we're going to tell ourselves, well, I can come up with a piece of code that is going to do what needs to be done here, and I'll be completely familiar with it because I'm the one who's going to have coded it in the first place, So no biggie. Let's get to work. But oftentimes we forget that this "let's get to work" part comes with a bunch of testing, a bunch of debugging, and other things that we're just underestimating, And here, just notice the nuance between working perfectly and good code, because yes, it is working perfectly, but it still is not good code if it is not trusted. So it's all about trust. And the Ikea effect here is not merely a play on words. It is an actual thing. It has its own Wikipedia page. And if you look it up, it's the effect that comes into play when we're placing a higher value on something just because we created it or partially created it. So in the case of Ikea, it clearly applies to furniture, but in the case of code, it can be because you're the author. There's two other effects that will also come into play. One is the mere exposure effect, and it's a tendency that we have to prefer things just because we're familiar with them, and that is completely understandable and natural. If we get to choose in between something we know nothing about, this code black box type of thing, and code that we're completely familiar with, if they're assumed to be both doing the same thing, which one are we going to choose? We're going to choose the one we're familiar with, not because it's better, not because of any other thing, just because we have quote unquote proximity with it. And the last effect is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that's the effect that comes into play when people with a low ability at any given task tend to overestimate their own ability. So in this case, the ability to write the code that's going to produce the desired effect. So we may be thinking, oh, it's just a few hours, and then a few hours, surprise, it turns into more hours, and then maybe twice the amount of hours or whatever, just far from what we had initially envisioned. And that really, it even came into play for myself when I thought I would be putting together the material for this very presentation. So yeah, we should be thinking about all those things when we're about to say, yeah, let's pull the plug on that code. And we should also be thinking about those things when we are writing our code, so that on the flip side, someone is not going to jump to the conclusion of writing it anew. So here are two things that came that were very surprising to me. The first one is a quote from Robert C. Martin, and he says that we're spending much more time reading code than writing code. And he says that we're spending 10 times more time reading code than writing it. So basically, for every hour we spend writing code, we're going to spend 10 hours reading code. For every 10 hours we spend writing code, we're going to spend 100 hours reading code. And that's a chunk of time. So if I'm spending that much time even if he's wrong, even if it's 5 to 1, it still is a whole lot. And for that amount of time, I'd rather spend it doing it something that I enjoy. And if I can trim it down, I'll be just happier, because I want to get back to coding, basically. So another thing is the fact that when we compare programming languages to regular languages that we teach, like French, Spanish, German, and so on, we teach programming language in a very different way than we teach regular languages. If we take a German class, chances are we're going to be shown like, okay, here is the syntax, so on and so on. And then people are going to say, well, now go read a novel, or now go see a movie or a play. They're not going to say, okay, here is the syntax, and now go write a novel. That's just not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. And yet with programming, we say, well, here's the syntax, and now go write some code. It starts with hello world. So maybe we should be spending more time reading code before we start writing it. So here's a funny quote from Steve McConnell, and he says, well, if we think we don't need to make our code readable, well, because no one else is going to look at it, we should be sure that we're not confusing cause and effect, and that is food for thought on how we justify ourselves about this. So I want to talk about naming, and don't worry, I'm not going to be forcing a naming convention on you. It's not what it's about. Having a naming convention is a good thing, but here we're just going to discuss naming at large, basically. So Phil Carlton says there's 2 hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. I know nothing about cache invalidation, and I'm sure it's a nightmare. But naming things, that too can be pretty hard. So it looks simple, but that's very deceptive. It's actually difficult to come up with the right name for something, and because oftentimes we don't envision everything of how something is going to be used and so on, and we should spend more time finding the right name. Naming is our most powerful tool. Naming is what we can use to be understood, and if we are designers, naming shows our intent and it tells a story. So how should we go about naming? Well, first I would say, let's be good parents. What does that mean? Well, it means in FileMaker, we get to rename things all the time if we want, and we see it as a feature, but is it really a feature? I'm thinking, well, maybe not so much. Basically, let's see if we think we're going to rename something later. First is later may not happen, and second is it's just a bad habit, and we don't do it for other things. Like if we say, okay, we have a child, and then comes 5-year-old, and we say, okay, Sam, happy birthday, Sam, and you know what? Going forward, we're gonna call you Sebastian because Sebastian is just so much better. No one does that, so so let's not do it for even for the items we're dealing with in our code. And we think that renaming is easy, and it is easy, but it's also easy for it to break stuff. Layouts, scripts, fields. It's just it used to be there were fewer moving parts, in all honesty, and now that we're dealing with server-side schedules, FMP URLs, API calls, a bunch of things that we can rename can actually break all those things. So if we choose the right name from day one, we won't have to rename, and we won't risk breaking anything. So let's spend more time early on and be done with it. The good news is we name stuff all the time. There's a ton of stuff in FileMaker that we get to name, from custom functions to tables and fields. layout objects, script variables, pretty much anything you can name. There's very little in FileMaker that you get to deal with that you don't get to name short of native functions. So now, all that said, what is it that we should avoid when we are naming our stuff? I would say let's avoid abbreviations. Okay, and I know that like our drop downs can be a bit restrictive sometimes, and we want to see things in full. And still, I would say try and not shorten your names into something that ends up being unreadable, really. Because if you ask yourself, say, let's take a full word and take 5 or 10 people and ask them all, how would you abbreviate that word? Chances are you're going to have different answers. So now take that same game and flip it on its head. If you come up with just the abbreviation and you ask 5 or 10 people, what's the full word behind that, you're going to have even more diverse answers. So it requires a lot of context for you to be able to figure out what's the right word behind an abbreviation. And usually it's just a couple more keystrokes, you know. So let's type those keystrokes. It's not where we can save time. If we're looking for something where typing fewer keystrokes is what is going to save us time, this is not where we should be looking. So a name is also not a shorthand or an acronym. And I'm saying that because once upon a time, I inherited a system where the developer before me chose to use a custom function, and the custom function was called GSB. And then I was like, oh, I haven't seen this before. What is it doing? And then I went to see the custom function definition, and sure enough, it was get script parameter. And then all across the system, I would come and read something, and then there would be this yet another custom function that really was meant to represent a native function. So I'd have to figure out how you would kind of condense the name of the native thing into his custom function, and it was just obfuscating the code a whole bunch. There's a lot of software products that will expand your keystrokes, so rely on that all you want, but don't make your names actual shorthands or acronyms, because that's just painful for whoever will be following your footsteps. And lastly, a name is not part of just an arbitrary series. So if you see anything that looks like that, say you have some fields or some scripts that are called XYZ new, XYZ old, XYZ new 2, that is not the good kind of lazy. That is really lacking in many aspects, creativity, originality. So call it what you want, but let's try to stay away from that kind of a pattern. Also, I would say that when naming things, let's be sure that the names we come up with are pronounceable and that they can be easy to search for using our preferred DDR tool. So now let's look at some examples. Okay, so we're going to have the bad guys here on the left. And so mostly variables, $PC, $prodcat, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, $D with a comment that says elapsed times and days, GSP I mentioned, and then a full-fledged calculation. So what could we be replacing this with? A couple suggestions. So $PC, how could we guess what it stands for? It would take a lot of context. And if I was to say it stands for product category, you'd need to go through a a decent amount of background information that lets you come to the conclusion that it is product category. And I didn't count how many letters those are apart, but it's not that hard to just type product category. So we really should be spelling things out. It makes it easier. And now that I've said that $PC means product category, I'm sure you can easily come to the conclusion that product cat or prodcat stands for product catalog. That's right, because there can be multiple things, not just this one thing that an abbreviation will expand to. So again, we don't have context, and every time we take something for granted, like context, it doesn't mean that the next reader is going to have that context. And if they don't have it, either they're going to come to the wrong conclusion, or we're making them hunt for that information, and that's just not fun. So now that variable that I didn't want to name earlier, who would have guessed that it stands for filtered student names? No one. No one is my guess. I mean, unless you're really given some kind of divine guessing ability, it's very hard to figure out that it could stand for this. So let's spell things out. Now for the next one, it's a bit different, because people could say, well, there's a comment, so that's more readable, right? Yes and no. Basically, I would just say, are we going to use that comment every time we're going to use the variable? Because if not, again, we're asking the reader to hunt for that information. But if we are going to use the comment every time we use the variable, then why not just name the variable the same way? That's more readable. We save on the comment, and we're good to go. So I already spoke about the GSP one, and the last one is not really about naming, because that's all native function calls. We don't get to choose how those things are called, but we can come up with a custom function. And if we say, okay, if is running on server, just by looking at that custom function, I know right away what I'm going to be expecting. And it's not that the calculation on the left is impossible to parse out and figure out what it means. It's just is still asking for our eye to do some work. And whereas on the right, we're saving a lot of that work, and it is more readable, and it's what it's about, So yeah, some recommendations. So let's just say that for Booleans, we would be safe to start with is or has, like is paid if we're talking about an invoice. For arrays and lists, I'd advise to use plurals. For functions and scripts, to make sure that we have both a verb and a target. And for everything, well, consistency, consistency, consistency. We shouldn't be switching between styles in a given system. So for naming itself, so if we use something where we use fetch, let's use fetch all the time, not fetch and retrieve and then get or something different. Same thing for how we create records. If we switch in between create and new and add, it just creates confusion. The same goes for prefix and suffix, upper and lower. Those things are meaningful. And if we just use them in different ways all the time, it's going to be impossible to decipher what the actual meaning is. So let's be specific. Let's be explicit. No one wants to guess what we were thinking. I just love that quote so much. If you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it again? It is so true about just about everything, and it applies to naming too. So let's be lazy. Let's not do stuff twice. Bad names are like raindrops. A single one is not going to ruin your day, but you never receive a single raindrop. The first one is only there to tell you that there is more to come. So here I want to share a little bit of something personal. When FileMaker 16 came out with JSON, I really was thrilled about it, and I started using the JSON path kind of naming all the way into my script variables. And so it would read something like you see on screen. So $invoice.bill2.zip and you may or may not like that, and that's up to you. The only reason I'm mentioning this here is because if you do like it, then make sure not to use it into fields, because the data API is using the field names as keys in the JSON that it's returning over to you. And keys with dots in them, they're not going to make you happy. So just a quick mention here to avoid that. Now, let's look at some more tools that we have that we can use when we're coding. Because if all we have is a hammer, of course, everything will look like a nail. And the hammer really here is comments. So yeah, so good code is like a good joke. It needs no explanation. How are we going to achieve that with code? Here's a couple things we should be looking into. First one is avoiding magic numbers. So what's a magic number? Well, here we have a basic loop pattern. Okay, so we say, okay, start a loop, exit if the counter is greater than 52, then do some stuff, and then increment, and so on up until you exit. But 52 what? There's no way to know. Again, we need context to know what 52 stands for. Now, if we take the same thing and we say, oh, I'm going to call a variable called week count and set it to 52, then it's the exact same loop. The only thing that changes is we took out 52 and we put in the variable name. And all of a sudden, now we know that we're looping on weeks. Same thing. If I take, again, the same loop, but I put my number into the variable deck size, then I know that we're dealing with cards. So this is an easy thing to do. That's going to make things more readable right away. I think there are things where we don't have to go overboard with this. You know, like 0 and 1s are okay. If you're rounding things to 2 decimals, if you're using 24 for the amount of hours in a day, and so on and so on. There are things that are just commonplace, so you don't need to change that. But if there's anything else that looks like you're just pulling it out of magician's hat, you know, because this is what it's about, then putting them into a variable is going to be easier to read. And also for your code, you know, if you need to update that with something else, you'll be good to go. So another one is to go easy on, I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble here with my, with my presentation. So go easy on negation. Here we have a very stark contrast on the slide. And it's a bit shocking. It's not in line with the rest of the slides, and it breaks the flow, you know. And the same happens when we are reading a calculation, and then there's some negation happening in the calculation itself. You know, our brain is more wired to understand straight statements that don't make use of negatives. So let's try to use it only if it is intuitive to do so. I'm sure that it happened to you That's at some point in time you went to layout mode and you wanted to hide something. You've put something into the calculation there to control the hide condition, and then came back to your layout to browse mode and said, how come it's still there? Well, that's the thing. You know, we're thinking in a different mindset for the hide condition. Sometimes we wish it would be show when. So this is what's happening here, and it can happen anywhere else. You know, if we write an if statement in the script, if we write a calculation with a test in a case or anything, let's try to keep things in a way that is going to be easy for us to understand no matter what. So that means using not as little as possible. Another thing we should be using is indentation, and that's easy to use. So here is a very simple calculation. It's just meant to concatenate the first name and last name and to throw in a comma if we have both of them. And it's not hard to parse again. But if we just present the same calculation just like this, now the spacing is inviting us to have things in pairs. And the comment we see is not there to say this is the default result. It's really there to preserve the pattern of pairs. So indentation can be really helpful when we're trying to read things and see what goes together. Now, it can be really harmful if we are indenting too much, you know, because there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and it really does apply to indentation. So especially if you're in a script and you're nesting and nesting and nesting your if statements, you'll end up there. So let's try and see what can be done to avoid indentation that is too deeply nested. And it's not limiting to scripting. It can happen in a regular calculation also. One more thing is white space. So here, the calculation on the left is really over simplistic for demonstration purposes. So we can clearly see what's going on there, and there's nothing that we would question about it. But still, when we look on the right-hand side, the extra white space we have, those extra carriage return, are making the pairs stand out. And if we had an example that was not so oversimplistic, if we had something where in the test conditions there were semicolons, or if some lines were wrapping over to the next lines, then again, the carriage returns would really make it easier on our eye to figure out, okay, these two goes together, then those two are the next pair, as opposed to just a big chunk of text where we have to pay attention. Wait a second, did I miss a semicolon? And all those kind of things. So white space in scripts has been there, as far as I'm concerned, forever. So there's no reason not to use it. And it helps us divide our scripts into subsections, and for each of those, we can kind of title the subsection, and we saw that naming things is good, and it applies for segments of our scripting. So let's make sure that we don't have something that is too dense in a script, that we use white space for things to breathe out and to name things at the same time, because naming is good. Custom function is another great tool we can use. We talked about that earlier for the is running on server custom function. So the fact that they're dry is really great. But above all of that, we get to choose the name, and that's really awesome. And I would say, even if we reuse a custom function that we've copied from some online resource, you're still free to change the name. You know, there's not going to be a custom function police coming up at your door and saying, hey, why is it you renamed this custom function? The original author meant for the name to be this and not that. And no, there's no such thing. You're completely free to rename it. Just know that if you are renaming a custom function that is heavily used by people in their code and that they're sharing their code, then as you copy that code into your own solution, that you're going to have to review those calls. So you have to be mindful of that. But it can be totally worth it to rename it to rename custom functions to have a naming that is consistent with the rest of the functions you use. Let statements. So again, let statements here can really help with readability. No surprise. We have a calculation here that is pretty basic. It's trying to give us the extended cost for an invoice line item, and the calculation is not super complex in itself. But if we come up with a let statement way of looking at the same thing, then we know right away that it's outputting the extended cost, because that's what the calculation tells us, at the very end. And if we're curious about how it comes to that conclusion, well, we can layer by layer unwrap and see, oh yes, this is what goes into how the extended cost is calculated. And again, I'm not saying that the first calculation we have at the top of this slide is completely impossible to understand. But if we were to have, say, a discount, and having to figure out what's the largest discount out of a product discount, a customer discount, a coupon, and a general sale, then I think the let statement would be more flexible and stay more readable, as opposed to trying to jam all of that into the first calculation. So, and yeah, about let statements, also one thing to mention is concerning performance. Sometimes the let statement can perform better than a regular calculation. Sometimes they can perform worse than a regular calculation. So you want to watch how you actually construct the let statement. And in some cases, if you're really looking for performance, well, it could be that you're only going to achieve it with a let statement, or it could be that you're only going to achieve it without the let statement. But if we're talking about readability, well, readability is really best with the let statement in most cases. One more thing here, and that is avoiding null values, or even avoiding values in our calls. And where is that happening? I would say most of the time it's going to be with plugin calls, but it can also be regular functions or even script parameters if we have something that is position-based. So if we look here at something that is a send mail command, for instance. So we say, okay, this is the send mail. And now I'm asking James, hey, could you tell me, please add a BCC in here? Well, James has no way to know where to put in the BCC. Is the BCC already someone listed here, like the some name at test.test or not? All he knows is he's going to have to look for the documentation and see where he can put in the BCC call. So if we were to take the exact same call and use this instead, then James is very happy. All he has to do is make sure that before the call happens, the BCC variable has whatever needs to be in there loaded, and he's good to go. He doesn't even have to change the actual function call. So that's really a winning approach for readability. And if we look at script parameters, if we are using position-based script parameters. Not something that I recommend, but some people will use something that is position-based. So here, if we're talking about adding a phone to a contact, well, we have an ID that we're sending in, and then something blank, and then a cell, and then what looks like to be the actual phone number. Again, if I ask James, hey James, what's that script second parameter again? Well, James has no choice but to go look into the script itself to know how the script parameter is parsed and to say, okay, second value stands for this. Whereas if we were to just name things out, say, okay, it's sending in a contact ID and then a flag that tells us if it's the primary phone or not, and then the phone type and phone number, we know right away. We don't need to go look into the script to figure out what this stands for. And sometimes our variable names are going to be more meaningful than the actual data that is being sent in. So here it's easy to look at just cell and figure out that it's the phone type and the phone number to know that it's the actual phone number. But sometimes the data is not going to be telling us how it's going to be used by the script. So variable names can be great for that. One thing we have here on the screen is to avoid perform fine with the restore option. And I would say it is it's really something that breaks the flow for the reader. Having to look at your file and say, well, if I want to know what the actual query is, I need to click on there, open up a dialog, close the dialog, and so on. Reading is really something where we want to keep the reader in the flow, and this is really against it. It just obfuscates what the actual query is, and it takes a lot of context. Again, if we want to guess what the query is, and I would argue that no, it's not something that we want to do. We don't want to be guessing what that query is. We don't want to be relying on context. We want to just see what the query is. So yeah, some other approach is just to put everything in the script. You know what a normal user would do in find mode. So let's set the fields, let's create new records and all that to build the request. And then follow with a perform find or whatever we need to get out of find mode. So and lastly is the script parameters. When we are looking at the header of our script, we should see in there how the variables are initialized early on. We should know what variables are expected to be sent as parameters. We don't want to see just the script starting right away, and then I don't know, on line 50 start to parse out the content of the script parameter. Because if we do that, what we can know for sure is someone is going to call the script without sending in the right parameters, and then what is going to happen is really going to rely on or depend on the error capture that we got in the script. So let's make sure that we are putting into the header part of our script something that makes it clear what is expected. And some people go even one step further than this. They take what is expected and they put it straight into the name of the script itself, making it pretty much like a function, and it is what it is. You know, it takes an input, it does something, and then it gives us an output. So it's just I tend to shy away from that just because script names have a limitation on the character length. But if that is something you want to do, by all means, go and do that. So this is a well-known quote, and I didn't put this one in my deck of slides just because it is a funny quote. I put this in into the slide deck because there's something that most people don't know about this quote. And what we don't know is this, that the original quote said code for readability, and also that the quote itself dates back to 1991, not 2012, not 2005, 1991. So, I mean, readability has been a concern for developers for a good while, and even before 1991, and it's going to remain a concern for the foreseeable future. So really, we should be paying attention about that stuff, because who knows, maybe the next guy is going to be a psychopath who knows where we live. So here is a quote from Joel Spolsky, and he found a very short way to say it all, pretty much. He says it's harder to read code than to write it, and that really ties directly into the quote we had earlier that said, any fool can write code that a computer can understand, but good programmers write code that humans can understand. And I think it takes a lot of expertise to really come to a conclusion like that, and find a way to express it in just a few words. Joel Spolsky is the founder of Trello, and I think he's also co-founder of Stack Overflow. So it's no surprise that he's pretty much well versed into that space. So if we look at just our general rules and recap, basically, let's explain our magic tricks. Secrets are not welcome. There are no bonus points for being sneaky, clever, fitting all our code into a single line. Saving keystrokes is not going to save us time. It will cost more time. Good naming is more than half the battle. Let's avoid magic numbers and use white space and indentation without nesting too much. Custom functions and let statements are our friends. We should avoid values in our calls and never make the reader guess. And lastly, we should spell it out for both find request and variable initializations. So by the end of all this, we should have our own writing style, and our own doesn't mean unique. It means that we are fully familiar with how we are going to be writing code, to the point that if a reader looks at our code, at some point, what comes next in the code will be predictable because of the trends and patterns it follows. The way things are will become what the reader expects, and that is when we can say mission accomplished. So let's look quickly into comments, because like I said, they're there, we can't ignore them. So we have Ron Jeffries here that says, code never lies, comments sometimes do. Code can only do what we tell it to do. Comments are not for the computer, they're for us. They drive nothing about our code. And every time we write a comment, if it is about what the code does, if the code is updated, our comment is at risk of being outdated. And comments that tell us what the code does are just heavy maintenance, and being lazy, I don't like maintenance. If I can skip on maintenance, I'll be happier. So let's try to not use comments in that way. So how should we use them then? Well, first, let's look at where we can use them in the FileMaker space. We're given field comments, script comments, although multi-line is not supported evenly on both platforms. There are end-of-line comments and block comments, and we also have notes that we can put on the relationship graph. So good comments will tell us why and not how. It will let us know what we're trying to do. It's going to skip over the obvious or what the script is already telling us. And for variables, if we want to use comments, we can use them to let us know okay, here are possible valid entries, or maybe the unit of measure when that's not part of the name, because I would argue unit of measure could be also part of the field name or the variable name. So so yeah, comments can be informative. They can be warnings. For instance, if someone else is debugging your code and you say, this perform script on server will run for about 5 minutes, and that's normal. There's no way the code itself can tell that to the other person. So that's one way to issue a warning that is good. And you can also use comments for to-dos. So that would be temporary, and what you hope for in that context is that someone, you or someone else, will later come back in the code and implement that to-do and remove the comment. So yeah, code can't explain why we're doing things this way, or why we chose one method over another, and it cannot discuss like why why we used or didn't use some alternatives. So that's what comments are for. You know, we can go into the header of our script and say, okay, well, we were challenged with this and that, and we use this because it solved this problem in this way, and we know that there are those drawbacks, but we account for that in some other ways. So those are good things to put into comments. You know, not like what's the code actually doing, because the code should already tell us that. So here we have Bertrand Meyer, who says that incorrect documentation is often worse than no documentation. And by often, I'm pretty sure he doesn't mean just like about 30% of the time. I'm sure he means like a very high percentage. And not only because being misled is a complete waste of time, but more importantly, because it erodes the trust relationship we have with the code. And everything is about trust. So what are some gadgets that we can use that are going to help us on this adventure? You know, what would we put in our backpack? Well, I would say one is MBS, and I'm saying this knowing that what I'm presenting here about MBS is only available on the Mac, and for free, even though MBS is a plugin that is available for both Mac and PC, and it's a paid plugin. But what I'm discussing here is available in the free version of the plugin on Mac. So it can check for variable names. It can apply custom syntax colorization, highlight pairs of if and loop and then loop, and basically a bunch of things that are very helpful, searching and in the relationship graph and so on and so on. So I use it a lot. I love it, and I have no hesitation into recommending it. One more thing you should look into is a text expanding utility. So here are a couple ones: atext, text expander, typinator. I think atext is maybe like $5. So there's really no reason not to use something like that. And if you are going to be working on both Mac and PC, just look for something that is cross-platform, because you're not going to be enjoying having to maintain your text expansions across two different sets of utilities. So lastly, I'm going to say make sure that you put your hands on a snippets folder. So something like Clip Manager, FM Clips, Dropship.fm, one more clip. There's a good chance that I'm not mentioning all of them out there, but all in all, it's a great tool to have to make sure that in the patterns that we replicate often, We don't go from memory. We just can rely on something we have in that snippet holder. So, and one more thing is MonoDraw. That is for Mac only. But if you are on Windows, you can try the URL for textic.com. And it's a bit like Visio meets ASCII art. Okay, so it's using monospace characters to represent shapes, and once you have that as text, then you can paste it into your relationship graph on Note, as long as you format the note with a monospace font, or even in script comments. Again, with script comments, I would say only on Mac, because that relies on the multi-line comments that the Mac will give us, but I don't think that's supported on Windows. So parting notes. Well, here we have a name that I'm not going to try to pronounce, but someone who says there are only two kinds of programming languages. Those people always bitch about, and those nobody uses. And that is to say, well, if you think the problem is coming from FileMaker, think again. Your code is not going to be more readable if you write it in another language. This is not what it's about. And lastly, a nice parody. So if you Google for how to write unmaintainable code, you're going to come up with this URL. And it's a great read. It's a bit lengthy, but it's very funny. And turns out, if you take every recommendations in there and you flip it on its head, you have a great set of guidelines on how to write code that is both readable and maintainable. So can be very inspiring. So on that said, I will say now all we have to do is to go write code that others will trust. And that's it.
That was really great. Thank you very much. I like that a lot.
Thank you.
I know I'm talking with people all the time about code styling and readability, commenting. A lot of times people are like, oh yeah, you can rewrite this and you can get it all done in one line. I'm like, but then it's hard to understand what's happening. And sometimes people will say that, oh, but it's more elegant. You've gotten it done in one line, you know what I mean? And rather than in 3 lines. But I was looking at like, I'm going to have to be back here in a year looking at this. And I'm not going to remember what this extraordinarily elegant one line did. It's this long.
Absolutely. And it can be a nice developer challenge. Okay. And I'm not against that. And I know that it used to be, there was not that much available memory, and there's a bunch of constraints that we were dealing with in the past, but I think most of that is pretty much in the past. So if you want to use that in code that is going to go into production and that's going to be put under someone else's eyeballs, I would suggest that it's not about being clever or having the shortest line of code. It's just, let's make it readable first,
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to geek out on what's the most
the fewest number of characters
you can write the same, then have some kind of developer challenge and go all out on that. Just don't put that into actual production environment. That's all I would say about this. I can understand sometimes if people are after performance, and sometimes we think that because it's shorter, it's going to be more performant, but it's not always the case, So.
And even in some other languages, you end up having auto minifiers anyway. I mean, FileMaker, I don't think that's going to be an issue, but in some other languages, you end up minifying the code anyway, so it's cuts a whole bunch out anyway. Comments are another thing like that too. I'm big on telling people, write comments about what the code is supposed to be doing here. Because if you come back to it a long time later, and there's a bug somewhere in there, you don't remember exactly what all of these lines were supposed to be doing or why you were doing this. Like, why am I excluding this one item from the found set?
Yes.
It can be really helpful to have
why is really
yeah.
why is really crucial, because sometimes you're looking at the code and you can say, oh, I see it does that, but is it doing the right thing or the wrong thing? You can only know that if you know why it's doing it. If you don't know why it's doing it, you can only assume. You can assume that it's doing it the right way, or you can assume that it's going to be wrong here because something else in the code elsewhere is pointing to some discrepancy or whatever. But it's really about why more than what is happening. What is happening, the code should already tell us that.
Yeah. Like if you have a comment that says, find all of the products other than digital products, and then you look through the lines that come after that, you can see, oh, I'm not excluding the digital products. That's why this isn't working correctly. Really easily.
Yes.
But if you don't have comments there, you can look through it and be like, okay, so I'm finding all of the products. That seems to be working correctly. But put some nice comments on there saying what it's supposed to be doing, what your requirements are for this block of code. Then when you're back 6 months later or a year later or many years later, you can remember what's supposed to be happening here and why, and see if something needs to get changed.
Yeah. There's a lot of things, and it's not always clear cut, And if we think of readability, there is say a mentality that is almost like the Boy Scout mentality, saying, well, whatever you put your eyes on, make sure that you leave the place a better place than it was when you came in, But then it's like if you are to have a line where you say, okay, well, introduce newer code or changes at all, and you have something else where you put on stability. Well, stability says if you want things to keep running the way they run, just don't change anything. That's the greatest assurance you have of stability. So where do you draw the line? Where is it you're going to start saying, okay, yes, this is not quite readable, we should change the code, or no, it may not be as readable as we want, but in terms of footprint, let's try and minimize our footprint instead of going in and changing a bunch of things. So there's no easy answer, basically.
Yep.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, Robert. This is Christy with Mac Advantage. I'm here with Todd.
Hi.
Hi there. I have a question for both of you guys. So when you're working on a legacy software or somebody else's code, for me anyway, if I'm adjusting, let's say, a script, I'll duplicate their script and put either a date at the end of it with an underscore or a pipe or something at the end. Do you guys do anything specific when you're working on previous code so that in case you need to bring back the original code, to name it or keep it for a period of time until the new changes work?
Well, I'll go first, David, and I'll let you complete. Basically, I feel like maybe what you're suggesting here could be about systems where you're working on the live production system. Am I right by saying that, or am I making assumptions here?
Well, on any version of it, just so that I can preserve what the original coding was in case the changes that I make are incorrect, to be able to get back to it in the way, instead of going to a previous version that's saved or something, to have it within the solution itself, so that if I needed to just grab something right there and pop it back in. Do you guys do that? Do you like? I typically don't like to change an original until I'm sure the original, the new ones are working properly before I get rid of any previous code. But I didn't know if there was a way that you guys might do things like that for scripting or.
Understood. Understood. So you can sure duplicate a script and say, okay, I'll make my changes in the original one, and the duplicated one is simply there like for safety purposes. If you need to revert back to what it was, you just go into the script and copy all the steps and put them back in the original script.
Right.
And it just if you do have, say, for instance, a DDR, and that you're using some DDR tools like event perception or like base element, I think, and possibly other tools. They're from the DDR, you can copy elements from the DDR back into your solution file. So if you have that close by, it can act as your de facto backup. Because of that, you may not rely as heavily on duplicating the script itself or the layout or things like that. Now, with layout, I would say it's a bit different, because when you paste the layout back in, no matter what you do, you're losing the tab order. And that even if you were to duplicate the original layout, once you start making changes, you can't go back to the duplicated layout, say, okay, copy all, and then paste that back into my original layout. There are some issues there, but all in all, it's not a problem. If you copy the original element, just make sure that at some point in time you end up doing your cleanup and saying, okay, I have reassured about the new code, and I can take away what's there, because otherwise it can make for a lot of white noise to sort through and figure out, is this being used, is it not being used, and sometimes we're afraid to delete something, not thinking, well, it's not, it may be used somewhere, we just don't know about it.
Oh, and that's always the fear.
Yeah. David, anything on that?
My strategy for things is usually, if I'm working on a new version of a complex script, for example, I'll make a dev version of it, and I'll copy the original one and rename the copy to dev. And I know that's like the dev version that I'm making the changes on. And then I'll work with that one for a while. When I'm ready to attempt to update the original, I'll copy the original and name that one, give it an old suffix, just call it whatever it is, old. And then copy the contents from the dev script to the unmodified original script. So then I've got three versions at that point. I have the old version, one with the old suffix. I've got the original script, which everything is linked to, so I'm not having to update all the other things that are pointing to it. And then and then the dev version. If everything looks good, then I'll usually go ahead and just delete the dev version, because there's not a need for it anymore. And then we just have the live version at that point. And an old one if you want to keep it there. Sometimes, well? If you've copied the contents of the script from your dev version to the live version that everything is linked to, if you have any buttons pointing to it or other scripts that are using it as a subscript, if you copy the contents, you don't have to worry about like, oh, did I forget to relink everything? And if you have the old version there, you can give it a week or two and just make sure everything's running smoothly, and you don't have to go back for some reason. And then you can decide if you want to delete the old version or not. But the idea there is old stuff isn't used anywhere if it has the old suffix, because it's something that you made while you were upgrading something else. And the dev version, might be used only for testing purposes. And you don't really have to worry about that. As far as naming goes, never name anything new or final, because it's never, new is temporary and final is never final. And then you end up with, my script new 2, my script new final, final this date. You know, it's
new final latest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then
well,
you're like,
a lot of times, if I'm dealing with fields that I'm not sure if are necessary or not, I'll put like 5 or 6 Z's in front of it with an underscore before what the field name was, so that if I'm glancing through things, it jumps out at me immediately to know that that is used maybe in a calculation somewhere or something else. Do you guys do anything with fields? Like I'll do that just to get at the bottom of the alphabetical list, to just put it Z underscore or a bunch of Z's when I'm trying to search for it. Or I guess the the DDR would probably take care of something like that too. But
that's what I recommend. If you want to cut a field out from being used, run a DDR. It'll show you every script and layout that it's used in, and keep cleaning things up, and then run a new DDR just to make sure that you've got it and make sure that its usages are none, and then you're safe to delete it.
Yeah, just watch for indirections.
A lot of this methodology was before DDRs came about. You know, a lot of us have been programming since the 1990s. So these are all the tricks we had to do before we had all these fancy tools.
Yes. Yes. So like it was a different time back then. Yes. Like when there was no script debugger and you had to like change your script and have say show custom dialog or put the field that you wanted to know the content on the layout to be able to see the content without because there was no data viewer and so on. So but we can be thankful that now we're in a totally different space, and I'm so glad that I get to work with FileMaker, because I feel like the tool is blazing fast to achieve things that otherwise would take a ton of time.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
Anything else?
No, this has been excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for presenting. I really enjoyed it as well. I think this was really great. And code readability is definitely an issue, I think, for everyone. So I think this is really something that everyone can benefit from watching. All right. So that's it for today. Our meetings for everyone. We are the first Wednesday of every month at 7 p.m. Eastern. We are always looking for presenters. So if you have something that you'd like to share with the group, presentation that you'd like to share, a product that you really like, something that you've developed that you want to show off, send me an email. It's david@bluefeathergroup.com. We'd love to have you on the schedule and get you in. Also, if you have anything that you'd like to see, if you just say, hey, I want to learn more about this, let me know. We'll find a presenter who wants to help educate you on that topic.
I do have a suggestion.
What's that?
I have been interested in how to use zoom gestures and ways to do things in FileMaker, like, if you're signing or looking at a graphic, to be able to script things to zoom in, zoom out, rotate, maybe a picture in a container field, something like that. I've been searching it a little bit, but I haven't been able to find a lot of.
Are you talking about manipulating
details.
Images in containers?
Well, so if you're just looking at a picture, let's say of a vehicle in a container field, or if not even in a container field, but in some kind of a URL generated graphic, to be able to rotate it or resize it, to use your fingers to zoom in and zoom out, and to do the gestures like you would on a touch iPad. And I think Todd Geist had some stuff about it, but I didn't really get super detailed into it. But just something like that is something that I find fascinating, to be able to use the zooming features and rotation features through FileMaker. I don't know if anyone's done something like that, but
yeah, send me an email as a reminder.
Okay.
But I'll look and see what I can find out about this sort of thing.
That I've looked at, that would be something that would interest me. It's just something different for like the iPhone and iPad type apps that you can do with FileMaker. Yeah.
Yeah, send me an email. I'll look into that and see if we can get someone.
Great. Thanks, David.
All right. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And we will see you next month.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you again,
Bye-bye.
Robert.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.